The silence in my study used to be my sanctuary, a heavy, velvet-lined fortress where the chaos of the world was filtered through the impartial lens of the law. For 32 years, as a senior judge in the heart of Greenwich, Connecticut, I've been the one who decides where the truth lies. I've looked into the eyes of murderers, white-collar thieves, and desperate men, and I've always been able to spot the flicker of a lie before it even left their lips. But that afternoon, as the golden October sun bled through the tall oak trees outside my window, the silence felt different. It felt like a trap. I didn't notice the change all at once. It started with the scent of faint, cloying trail of expensive, floral perfume that didn't belong to my late wife, Margaret. Then, my eyes settled on my mahogany desk. I am a man of precise habits. My pens are always aligned parallel to the blotter, and my manila folders are stacked by case priority. One folder, containing the deed to my family estate and my primary investment accounts, was tilted exactly 3 degrees to the left. My breath hitched. I moved closer, my joints complaining with a dull ache that reminded me I was 72, though my mind remained as sharp as a serrated blade. I crouched down to examine the bottom drawer of my private filing cabinet. There they were, tiny, jagged silver scratches around the keyhole. Someone hadn't just looked, they had forced their way in. They had been clumsy, or perhaps they just assumed I was too old to notice. I stood up slowly, the blood roaring in my ears like a distant storm. In that moment, I wasn't just a father or a grandfather. I was a judge presiding over the most personal case of my life. I knew someone had been hunting through my life, looking for the keys to my kingdom. The question wasn't just who it was, how far they had already gone. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, the kind of professional detachment I used to feel when delivering a life sentence. I didn't know it yet, but my own home had become a crime scene, and the suspects were currently downstairs, waiting for me to join them for dinner. "Alistair, are you coming down, dear? The cacao vin is getting cold." The voice belonged to Sloane, my daughter-in-law. She was a woman of impeccable breeding and sharp, icy beauty, the kind of woman who treated a dinner party like a tactical maneuver. My son, Julian, had brought her into the Sterling family 4 years ago, and from the moment she stepped onto our ancestral hardwood, she had begun updating things. First the curtains, then the upholstery, and eventually, I feared, the patriarch himself. I took a deep breath, smoothed my vest, and descended the grand staircase. The dining room was lit by flickering candlelight that cast long, dancing shadows against the portraits of my ancestors. Julian sat at the foot of the table, his eyes fixed on his wine glass. He was a Harrison Sterling through and through, tall, broad-shouldered, but with a softness around the jaw that told me he'd never quite developed the spine required for our family name. "You look deep in thought, Father," Julian said, his voice forced and unnervingly bright. "Just reflecting on some old cases," I replied, taking my seat. I watched Sloane as she served the wine. Her movements were fluid, graceful, yet there was a tension in her wrists, a white-knuckled grip on the crystal decanter. I noticed someone was in my study today. The cleaning staff, perhaps? The air in the room seemed to vanish. Sloane didn't blink. She offered a small, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, I had the vents dusted, Alistair. You know how the allergens are this time of year. I hope they didn't disturb your papers." "Papers can be replaced," I said, swirling the dark red liquid in my glass. "It's the trust that's harder to fix." Julian cleared his throat, a nervous, hacking sound. "Speaking of trusts, Dad," Sloane and I were talking. "With the market being so volatile, and your recent bouts of forgetfulness, maybe it's time we looked at the Sterling Estates management again, just to take the burden off your shoulders." There it was. The opening move. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the familiar hum of a cross-examination beginning. "My forgetfulness?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "I don't recall being forgetful, Julian. In fact, I remember exactly where I put every document in that study." I saw the briefest flicker of panic cross Julian's face. He looked at Sloane, a silent plea for help. She leaned forward, her diamonds catching the candlelight. "Alistair, we only say this out of love. Last week, you forgot your appointment with Dr. Eris, and you left the stove on Tuesday night. We're worried. This house is so large, so isolated. Don't you think a more managed environment might be safer? Somewhere with professional care?" I didn't leave the stove on. I knew it, and they knew I knew it. They were gaslighting me, building a narrative of senility to justify taking control. They weren't just looking for my money. They were looking to erase me while I was still breathing. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised on stories of honor and integrity, and realized he was no longer a participant in my legacy. He was a scavenger. "I'll take it under advisement," I said, a phrase that had ended 1,000 legal arguments. I went back to my meal, the chicken tasting like ash in my mouth. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, listening to the house breathe. I heard the floorboards creak, not the random settle of an old mansion, but deliberate, hushed footsteps. They were moving again, at high. Hongam. I crept to my window and looked down at the driveway. A black SUV I didn't recognize was idling near the gates. A man in a sharp, dark suit stepped out and met Julian by the garage. They spoke in low, urgent tones, and I saw Julian hand him a thick, white envelope. The man was Vance Blackwood. I recognized him instantly. He was a fixer for the local underworld, a disgraced lawyer I'd personally disbarred 10 years ago for tampering with evidence. Seeing him on my property was like seeing a wolf in the nursery. I knew then that I couldn't fight this from the inside. I needed to see what they were doing when they thought I wasn't looking. I needed to become a ghost in my own life. The next morning, I announced I was taking a 2-week trip to the Berkshires. "I need the mountain air to clear my head," I told them over breakfast. "Perhaps you're right, Sloan. Maybe I am just tired." Their relief was palpable. They practically helped me pack my bags, their smiles wider and more sincere than they had been in months. Julian even offered to drive me to the train station, but I insisted on taking my own car. I drove out of the gates at noon, watching them in the rearview mirror. They stood on the porch, arm in arm, looking for all the world like the heirs to a throne they hadn't earned. But I didn't go to the Berkshires. I drove 3 miles to a nondescript motel on the edge of town, checked in under a false name, and waited for nightfall. At midnight, I returned to the neighborhood on foot, cutting through the woods that bordered the Sterling estate. The autumn air was biting, but I didn't feel the cold. I moved toward the old Whitaker property, which had sat vacant for 3 years. From the second-story window of that derelict house, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my own study and the back entrance to my home. I settled into a rusted metal chair, my binoculars at the ready. The lights in my house were blazing. It was then that I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, ready to defend myself. In the shadows stood Eleanor Vance. She was my neighbor from 2 doors down, a woman in her late 70s who had always been a fixture at our local garden club. She looked frail, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, but her eyes were as sharp as diamonds. "I wondered when you'd show up, Alistair," she whispered, her voice gravelly but firm. "Eleanor, what on earth are you doing here?" She stepped closer, the moonlight illuminating the deep lines of worry on her face. She took my hand, and I was shocked by the strength in her grip. "I've been watching them for weeks, Alistair. Ever since they started bringing that Blackwood man around. I tried to call you, but Sloan always answered. She told me you were resting, that you shouldn't be disturbed." "What have you seen?" I asked, my voice trembling. Eleanor looked toward my house, her expression turning grim. "They aren't just waiting for you to decline, Alistair. They're accelerating the process. Every night at midnight they bring in the specialist. He's not a doctor. He's something else." She leaned in closer, her breath hitching. "Stay here. Watch that window. At exactly muy high. Muy lum. They'll move into the kitchen. That's when you'll see the truth of what your son has become." I turned back to the binoculars, my hands shaking. I focused on the kitchen window. The lights were low. I saw Sloan enter, holding a small brown vial. She was smiling a genuine, terrifying smile. She leaned over a pot of tea, the same herbal tea she'd been making for me every night for the past month. I watched as she carefully counted 10 drops of a clear liquid into the pot. Then Julian walked in. He didn't look horrified. He didn't stop her. He simply watched, then reached out and stroked her hair. They shared a look of such profound, mutual greed that it made me physically ill. Suddenly, the front door of my house swung open. The man, Vance Blackwood, stepped out onto the porch, looking directly toward the vacant house where I was hiding. He pulled out a radio and spoke into it, his eyes scanning the tree line. "We have a problem," I heard a voice crackle from a scanner Eleanor was holding. The old man's car was spotted at the motel. He never left town. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just stealing my money. They were hunting me. And as the headlights of a car turned into the driveway of the vacant house, I realized the hunter had just become the prey. The headlights of the vehicle sliced through the dust-moated air of the vacant house, sweeping across the peeling wallpaper like searchlights. My heart, an organ I'd spent decades convincing myself was purely secondary to my intellect, felt like it was trying to punch its way through my ribs. Eleanor gripped my forearm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into the wool of my coat. "Basement," she hissed, her voice a razor-thin whisper. "Now, Alistair." We moved with the frantic, jerky grace of the elderly in crisis. My knees popped a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the hollow house. But we made it to the service stairs just as the car's engine cut out. We descended into the damp, smelling of earth and old rot, and huddled behind a rusted oil tank. Above us, the front door groaned open. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps thudded across the floorboards. "Clear," a voice growled. It was Blackwood. I knew that gravelly baritone from a dozen court proceedings. "He's not here." "The car at the motel must have been a decoy, or he's moved on. Check the perimeter." "He can't have gone far," another voice replied Julian. My own son, the sound of his voice, once my greatest pride, now felt like a physical infection. "Sloane is losing her mind, Vance. She says if he's not incapacitated by the weekend, the board meeting at Sterling Holdings will go through, and we're finished. We need that signature." "You'll get the signature," Blackwood said, his tone chillingly dismissive. "One way or another, a man his age, accidents happen when the mind starts to go. Now get back to the house. If he comes back, you need to be the worried, grieving family, not a search party." The door slammed, and eventually, the sound of the gravel crunching beneath tires signaled their departure. I slumped against the cold metal of the tank, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Eleanor didn't let go of my arm. "They're not just waiting for you to die, Alistair," she said, her eyes burning in the dark. "They're writing the obituary while you're still standing." "I should have seen it," I whispered, the weight of my own blindness crushing me. "I'm a judge, for God's sake. I'm paid to see through the theater." But looking back now, the signs weren't just there. They were screaming. I had been so blinded by the desire to see my son succeed that I'd ignored the rot at the foundation of his life. Julian had always been a sterling, expected to carry the weight of a 300-year-old legacy. But the legacy was a suit of armor he was too small to fill. The trouble started 3 years ago, though I didn't recognize it as trouble then. Julian had come to me, hat in hand, asking for a massive injection of capital for Sterling North, a boutique investment firm he'd started in Manhattan. I'd given it to him, of course. He was my only child. I thought I was investing in his future. I didn't realize I was subsidizing a gambling addiction to high-risk derivatives. Then came Sloane. She appeared at a charity gala for the Greenwich Arts Council, a vision in emerald silk and ruthless ambition. She was the daughter of a failing textile magnate from Virginia, old money that had run out of cash 2 generations ago. She saw in Julian exactly what I had missed, a weak point. She didn't fall in love with my son. She fell in love with the sterling deed and the 8-figure investment portfolio attached to it. Within 6 months of their wedding, the accidents began. The first was the incident with the stove. I'd woken up in the middle of the night to the shrill scream of the smoke alarm. The kitchen was filled with a thick, blue haze. I found Julian and Sloane already there, Sloane fanning the air with a silk scarf, looking at me with a mixture of pity and horror. "Alistair, honey," she'd said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "You left the gas burner on under an empty kettle. You could have burned us all alive." I had been certain I hadn't touched the stove. I'd spent the evening in my study reading, but the evidence was right there, the glowing red dial, the scorched kettle. I apologized, feeling a cold shiver of doubt. That was the first open loop they planted in my mind, the idea that my reality was no longer reliable. Then came the missed appointments. My longtime physician, Dr. Eris, had called me, sounding frustrated. "Alistair, that's the 3rd checkup you've missed this month. Is everything okay?" I had no memory of the appointments. When I checked my leather-bound planner, the entries were there, written in a hand that looked suspiciously like mine but lacked the characteristic sharp slant of my T's. When I confronted Sloane about it, she sighed, a long, mournful sound. "We tried to remind you, Alistair. You just got so angry. You told us to stop hovering." I started to believe her. I started to believe that I was becoming the very thing I feared most. A flickering candle, losing its light. I grew quiet. I withdrew into my study, which was exactly what they wanted. It gave them the space to bring in the specialists, the lawyers, and the doctors, who weren't on any official registry. But as I sat in that damp basement with Eleanor, the fog finally lifted. It wasn't dementia, it was the tea. The herbal blend Sloane made for me every night, to help with your restlessness. Alistair wasn't a sedative. It was something more insidious. A slow-acting hallucinogen or a cognitive depressant. something that left me suggestible, groggy, and prone to losing hours of my life. She wasn't just gaslighting me with words. She was chemically altering my brain to fit their narrative. "I have to go back," I said, standing up. My legs felt stronger now, fueled by a cold, judicial fury. "You can't," Eleanor argued. "They'll know you've seen them. Blackwood is a dangerous man, Alistair. He doesn't just fix legal problems, he fixes people problems." "I'm not going back as a victim," I said, looking her in the eye. "I'm going back as a witness. If I stay hidden, they win. They'll file for emergency conservatorship on Monday morning, citing my disappearance as the final proof of my mental collapse. I have to be there. I have to let them think their plan is working." Eleanor watched me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She reached into her heavy coat and pulled out a small, high-definition button camera. "My grandson gave me this. He's a bit of a tech head. I've been using it to record their visitors from my porch. Take it. Pin it to your vest." I took the device. It was no larger than a nickel. "And Alistair?" Eleanor whispered as I prepared to climb back up the stairs. "Don't drink the tea." I walked back to the motel, my mind racing. I needed a counter-strategy. In court, you never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. I needed to know exactly what was in that white envelope Julian had handed Blackwood. I needed to know the closing date for whatever theft they were finalizing. I returned to my motel room and spent the remaining hours of the night making calls. I called Marcus Webb, a former defense attorney who owed me a life-altering favor. 10 years ago, I'd given his son a second chance on a drug charge that would have ended his life. Marcus was now a high-priced corporate investigator. "Alistair? It's 3 a.m, Marcus ground. "I need you to look into a man named Vance Blackwood," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "And I need a deep dive into the recent filings for Sterling Holdings. Someone is trying to sell the foundation out from under me, Marcus. I need to know who's buying." "Blackwood? He's bottom feeder, Alistair. If he's involved, someone is looking to get dirty. I'll have what I can by morning." I hung up and stared at the beige walls of the motel. I felt a profound sense of mourning, not for my money, but for the son I thought I knew. Julian wasn't just a failure. He was a traitor. He was willing to erase his father's mind to pay off his own debts. The next morning, I drove back to the Sterling estate. I pulled through the gates with the windows down, letting the crisp air fill the car. As I pulled into the driveway, the front door flew open. Julian and Sloane rushed out, their faces twisted into masks of exaggerated relief. "Father, thank God," Julian cried, rushing to my door. "We've been calling the hotels in the Berkshires for hours. You never arrived. We were about to call the police." "I got turned around, Julian," I said, my voice shaky, playing the part of the confused old man. I let him take my arm, feeling the tremor of his own nerves through his sleeve. I found myself in a diner in Danbury. I didn't know where I was for a few hours. It was frightening. Sloane tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her eyes scanning me for any sign of deception. "Oh, you poor thing. We told you the drive was too much. Come inside. I'll make you some tea. You need to rest." "Yes," I murmured, leaning heavily on my cane. "The tea." "That sounds lovely, Sloane." As we walked into the house, I noticed a new piece of mail on the foyer table. It was a thick, legal-sized envelope from a firm called Blackwood Associates. My heart skipped a beat. They were moving faster than I thought. "What's this?" I asked, reaching for it. Sloane moved with the speed of a viper, snatching the envelope before my fingers could touch it. "Just some boring tax documents, Alistair. Julian will handle it. Why don't you head up to your study? I'll bring the tea up in 10 minutes. I nodded and climbed the stairs, every step a calculated performance of frailty. Once inside my study, I locked the door and moved to my desk. I didn't look at the papers. I looked at the hidden camera pinned to my vest. I turned it on. I sat in my chair and waited. My ears were tuned to the sounds of the house. 10 minutes later, a soft knock came at the door. "Alistair? I have your tea." I opened the door. Sloane stood there with a silver tray. The steam rose from the porcelain cup, carrying that same floral, cloying scent. She set it on the desk and patted my hand. "Drink it all, dear. It will help the confusion go away." She left, and I sat staring at the cup. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat down the hall. Then, I pulled a small, empty plastic vial I'd bought at the pharmacy that morning from my pocket. I carefully poured a sample of the tea into the vial and tucked it away. The rest, I poured into the potting soil of a large mahogany fern in the corner of the room. I sat back and closed my eyes, counting the minutes. I needed to sound groggy. I needed to sound defeated. Downstairs, the front door opened again. I heard the low murmur of voices. Blackwood was back. Is he down? I heard Blackwood ask from the bottom of the stairs. He's finishing the tea now, Sloane replied. He's completely out of it. He thinks he spent the night in Danbury. Good, Blackwood said. Bring the papers up. The notary is in the car. We need the signatures on the transfer of title and the power of attorney tonight. The buyers are closing the offshore account on Monday. This is the only window. I felt a surge of cold terror. Tonight. They were planning to strip me of everything tonight. I heard them coming up the stairs. 3 sets of footsteps. Julian, Sloane, and Blackwood. I slumped forward in my chair, letting my head loll to the side, my eyes half closed. I made my breathing shallow and ragged. The door opened. Father? Julian whispered. He moved to the desk and shook my shoulder. I let out a low, incoherent moan. He's under, Sloane said, her voice devoid of any warmth. Get the pen, Julian. Let's get this over with. I felt a heavy document being placed on the desk in front of me. Julian's hand gripped mine, guiding it toward a signature line. I could feel the cold metal of the pen being pressed into my fingers. Just sign here, Dad, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. It's for the best. You won't even remember this tomorrow. I stayed limp, waiting for the perfect moment. But as the pen touched the paper, I realized something that stopped my heart. Julian wasn't just signing a transfer of title. I caught a glimpse of the header on the second page as Sloane flipped it. It was a durable power of attorney and medical proxy. But below that, in smaller print, was a document I hadn't expected. A voluntary admission for long-term psychiatric care. They weren't just taking the money. They were committing me to a locked facility the moment the ink was dry. And as I felt Julian's hand begin to move my own to form the first letter of my name, the front gate bell rang a sharp, insistent peal that echoed through the house. Who the hell is that? Blackwood hissed, snapping his head toward the window. I don't know, Sloane said, her face pale. We weren't expecting anyone. I kept my eyes shut, but inside, I was screaming, because I knew who it was. I had called Marcus Webb to send me the information, but I hadn't told him to come to the house. If it was Marcus, he was walking into a trap. But if it wasn't Marcus, who was at the gate? And more importantly, would they get to me before Julian forced the pen across the page? The chime of the doorbell reverberated through the house like a funeral bell, jarring and final. I felt Julian's hand jerk away from mine, the pen clattering onto the mahogany desk. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by my own forced, shallow breathing and the frantic thrumming of Julian's pulse, which I could almost hear from where I lay slumped. I told you the gate was supposed to be locked, Vance, Sloane hissed, her voice a jagged whisper that sliced through the room's tension. If that's the police, we're done. I'm not going to prison because you couldn't secure a driveway. Shut up, Sloane, Blackwood snapped. He moved to the window, peeling back the heavy velvet curtain just an inch. I kept my eyes slitted, a mere hairline of vision allowing me to see the silhouette of his broad shoulders against the moonlight. It's a patrol car. Local PD. Officer Miller. Julian let out a choked sound, half sob, half gasp. Miller? He knows my father. They play chess at the club once a month. If he sees him like this. He won't see him, Blackwood said, turning back into the room. His eyes were cold, calculating pits of darkness. Julian, get down there. You're the concerned son. Your father had a rough night. He's sleeping it off. Sloane, stay here. If the old man makes a sound, cover his mouth. I'll go out the back and circle around. If this goes south, I was never here. The room blurred as Julian scrambled toward the door. I heard the frantic rhythm of his footsteps receding down the stairs, followed by the heavy thud of the front door opening. I remained limp, my head lolling against the leather of my chair. Sloane stood over me, her breathing coming in sharp, serrated edges. I could smell her perfume, the same cloying floral scent that had masked the bitter tang of the chemicals in my tea. It was the smell of my own undoing. You old fool, she whispered, so low it was almost a caress. You should have just retired when we asked. You had to be the great Alistair Sterling until the very end, didn't you? I felt her hand brush against my neck, checking for a pulse. I kept my muscles loose, mimicking the profound lethargy of a man whose brain had been turned to sludge. Below us, I heard the muffled drone of voices. I focused every ounce of my will on the sound. Evening, Officer Miller. Julian's voice drifted up, cracking slightly at the end. Is something wrong? It's a bit late for a social call. Sorry to bother you, Julian, a deep, steady voice replied. Miller. I remembered him, a young man I'd sworn in 10 years ago. He was honest to a fault, the kind of cop who believed in the badge. "We got a call about a black SUV idling near your gate for the last few hours. Neighbor reported suspicious activity. I saw the gate was open, so I thought I'd check in on the judge. Is Alistair around?" He's sleeping, officer. He had a bit of a scare today. Got lost in Danbury. We're quite worried about his cognitive state, actually. We've been keeping him quiet on doctor's orders." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that it made my stomach turn. This was the Julian I hadn't wanted to see, the one who had learned how to manipulate the truth in the shadows of my own courtroom. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of Julian at 10 years old, crying because he'd broken a window and couldn't bear to tell me the truth. I had hugged him then, told him that the truth was the only thing that made a man free. I had failed him. I had taught him the law, but I hadn't taught him the soul of it. "Lost in Danbury? That doesn't sound like the judge," Miller said, his tone shifting from casual to professional concern. "Maybe I should just have a quick word? Just to make sure he's all right? Department policy on welfare checks for seniors, you know how it is." "He's really not up for it, officer," Julian said, his voice rising in pitch. "It might agitate him. You know how proud he is. Seeing a uniform in his own house while he's in this state, it would break him." Upstairs, Sloane's grip tightened on the edge of the desk. She was leaning toward the door, listening with the intensity of a predator. She didn't notice my hand move slightly, just enough to ensure the button camera on my vest was clear of the shadow cast by my lapel. "I understand," Miller said, though there was a lingering doubt in his voice that gave me a flicker of hope. "Tell him I stopped by. And Julian, if you need anything, any help with the arrangements, you let the station know. Your father is a legend in this town." "I will. Thank you, officer." The door closed. I heard the patrol car pull away, the gravel crunching beneath its tires. A moment later, Julian burst back into the room, his face slick with sweat. "That was too close," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "We can't wait until Monday. We have to do this now. If Miller comes back or if someone else calls." "I agree," Blackwood said, stepping out of the shadows of the hallway. He hadn't left. He'd been waiting just out of sight. "The buyer is already in town. He's staying at the Sterling Grand. He wants the deed signed tonight, or the offer drops by 20%. He knows you're desperate, Julian." "Who is the buyer?" Julian asked, wiping his forehead with a trembling hand. "You never gave me a name, Vance." "Just the group." Blackwood smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. "Does it matter? They're paying cash. $650,000 over market value. It covers your debts and leaves you enough to start over in the Caymans." "Isn't that what you wanted?" "I want to know who is taking my family's house," Julian insisted, a rare flash of the sterling spine appearing. Blackwood sighed, reaching into his inner coat pocket and pulling out a final set of closing documents. He tossed them onto the desk next to my slumped form. "Fine. Look for yourself." Sloane snatched them up, her eyes scanning the lines. Her breath hitched. "Harrison Beaumont? The Beaumont family?" I almost gasped. Harrison Beaumont. The name was a ghost from my past, a man whose empire I had dismantled 15 years ago in a landmark racketeering case. I had sent his father to prison and seized their assets. It was the case that had made my career and ruined theirs. And now, they were the ones buying my home. They weren't just buying property, they were buying a trophy. They were going to turn the Sterling estate into a monument to my failure. "They want him broken, Julian," Blackwood said quietly. "The money is the price of his humiliation. They're the ones who suggested the psychiatric facility. They want the great Judge Alistair Sterling spending his final years in a padded room, wondering where it all went wrong." Julian looked at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of the son I loved. He looked horrified. He looked at the documents, then at the pen, then at the vial of chemicals on the tray. He was standing at the edge of a precipice, and for one heartbeat, I thought he might step back. "He's my father, Vance," Julian whispered. "He's a man who's already gone," Sloane snapped, stepping toward him and grabbing his shoulders. Her voice was a hiss of pure venom. "Look at him, Julian. He's a shell. If you don't do this, the bank takes everything anyway. We'll be in the street. You'll be in prison for the embezzlement at the firm. Do you want to go to a cell where the men your father sentenced are waiting for you?" Julian's face crumpled. The last of his resistance evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a hollowed-out coward. He picked up the pen. "Okay," he said, his voice dead. "Okay." He moved behind me, reaching around to grab my right hand. His touch was cold, clammy with the sweat of his betrayal. He forced my fingers around the pen. I felt the sharp point of the nib touch the parchment of the title transfer. I didn't know it yet, but the man at the door wasn't there to save me. He was the final piece of their puzzle. I realized then that I couldn't let them sign. If the signature was on that paper, even a forged one, the legal battle to undo it while being held in a psych ward would take years. Years I didn't have. I had to break the ruse. I had to strike now, while I still had the element of surprise. But as I prepared to shove Julian back and reveal my lucidity, the house's security system let out a series of frantic beeps. The monitor on my desk flickered to life, showing the front gate again. Another car was there, a silver Mercedes. "What now?" Blackwood roared, losing his composure. I looked at the monitor through my lowered lashes. It was Marcus Webb. But he wasn't alone. In the passenger seat was a woman I recognized from the county recorder's office. And in the back seat was something else, something that made Blackwood's face go pale. "It's a process server," Blackwood whispered. "And an investigator. How did they get here so fast?" "Julian, the signatures. Now," Sloan screamed. Julian panicked. He gripped my hand with a crushing force, trying to jerk the pen across the signature line. "Sign it. Just sign it, damn you." I couldn't wait any longer. I twisted my hand, not away from the paper but toward Julian's wrist. I gripped him with every ounce of strength I had left, my eyes snapping open to meet his. The shock in his expression was the most satisfying thing I had seen in decades. "The court is in session, Julian," I said, my voice no longer a whisper, but the booming baritone that had commanded respect for 30 years. "And you're in contempt." I shoved him back with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. He hit the bookshelf, a shower of legal tomes raining down on him. Sloan screamed, lunging for the documents on the desk, but I snatched them away, backing toward the corner of the room. Blackwood reached into his jacket, his hand moving toward his waist. "You old bastard, you think you can play us?" "I'm not playing, Vance," I said, holding up my phone, which I'd pulled from my pocket. It was already connected to the house's speakers. The audio of the last 10 minutes, the talk of the Beaumonts, the psychiatric ward, the embezzlement, began to blast through the mansion at full volume. "I've been recording everything. Every word. Every drop in the tea." The sound of their own voices, distorted and monstrous, filled the room. Outside, I heard the screech of tires as Marcus and his team bypassed the gate. "Give me those papers," Blackwood said, stepping toward me. He didn't pull a gun, but he pulled a heavy, weighted sap from his pocket. "Or I'll make sure you don't live long enough to see the inside of that asylum." I looked at the door. I looked at my son, who was huddled on the floor, weeping. I looked at Sloan, whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You're too late, Vance," I said, glancing at the monitor. The police didn't leave. They just parked around the corner. The sound of sirens began to wail, growing louder with every passing second. But as Blackwood lunged at me, I realized I'd made one fatal mistake. I had focused on the law, on the evidence, on the case. I had forgotten that a cornered animal doesn't care about the verdict. The sap swung toward my head, and the world exploded into white light. As I slumped to the floor, the documents fluttering away like dying birds, the last thing I saw was my son standing up. He wasn't moving to help me. He was reaching for the vial of chemicals on the tray. "If you won't sign, Father," Julian whispered, his voice sounding as if it were coming from miles away, "then you'll just have to disappear another way." I didn't know it then, but the betrayal was only beginning. What they had planned for me next was a nightmare that no courtroom could ever prepare me for. The world didn't come back all at once. It returned in jagged shards of sensation, the cold bite of the hardwood floor against my cheek, the metallic tang of blood in the back of my throat, and a rhythmic, pulsing throb behind my eyes that felt like a gavel striking a hollow chest. I could hear voices, but they sounded like they were underwater, distorted, echoing, and stripped of their humanity. I tried to move my hand, but my fingers felt like lead weights. The concussion was a heavy fog, but through the haze, the instinct of a 30-year career flared to life. I wasn't just Alistair Sterling right now. I was a man dying in his own house, and I needed to listen. "Is he dead?" That was Julian. His voice was high, thin, and vibrating with a terror that made me want to weep for the boy he once was. "Vance, you hit him too hard. Look at the blood. If he's dead, this isn't fraud anymore. This is capital murder." "He's breathing, you spineless brat," Blackwood growled. I felt a heavy boot nudge my ribs, a sharp spark of pain that forced a silent ground to die in my throat. "But he's not going to be a problem. Sloan, get the kit. We don't have time for the tea anymore." We used the needle. The sirens, Sloane said. Her voice was the only thing in the room that remained steady, as cold and sharp as a scalpel. Blackwood, the police are at the gate. If we don't handle this now, we're all going to be wearing orange by sunrise. I told you the sirens aren't for us, Blackwood snapped. I heard the rustle of paper, the documents they so desperately needed. That was a decoy. My man called in a multi-car pileup 3 blocks away. Those sirens are heading for the intersection, not here. But Miller is still out there somewhere, and your friend Marcus Webb is at the gate. We have 3 minutes before they realize the gate code has been wiped. I lay there, paralyzed by the blow but fueled by a cold, incandescent rage. They had planned for the sirens. They had manufactured a catastrophe just to clear their path. It was a level of professional malice I hadn't expected from Blackwood, and certainly not from my son. I felt the floor vibrate as Sloane moved toward me. There was a faint click, the sound of a protective cap being removed from a syringe. Julian, hold his arm, Sloane commanded. I can't, Julian whispered. Sloane, he's my father. He's looking at me. I think his eyes are open. Then don't look back. Do you want to spend 30 years in a cell next to the animals he put away? Hold. His arm. I felt Julian's hands on me. They were shaking so violently I could feel the tremors through my sleeve. He pinned my forearm to the floor. I tried to fight, to jerk away, but my muscles were unresponsive, trapped in the neuroelectric storm of the concussion. Then came the sting, a cold, sharp prick just above my elbow. A wave of artificial ice began to crawl up my vein, heading for my heart. It wasn't the slow, suggestive fog of the tea. This was a chemical hammer. What I didn't know yet, I thought as the darkness began to reclaim the edges of my vision, was that the needle wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to make me invisible. The last thing I heard before the void swallowed me was the sound of the heavy oak doors of my study being thrown open. Not by the police, but by 2 men in white uniforms, private medical transport. Blackwood had thought of everything. He hadn't just brought a fixer, he'd brought a ghost crew. To any neighbor watching, it would look like a medical emergency. A tragic, sudden decline for the aging Judge Sterling. I woke up in a room that didn't have corners. The walls were a soft, padded cream, lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed with a maddening, low-frequency buzz. My head felt like it had been split open and stitched back together with barbed wire. I tried to sit up, but the world tilted violently. I was strapped into a narrow bed, leather restraints biting into my wrists and ankles. Don't fight it, Judge, a voice said from the corner of the room. The more you struggle, the more it looks like a manic episode. I squinted, my vision slowly pulling into focus. A man sat in a plastic chair near the door. He was wearing a lab coat, but his posture was all wrong, too stiff, too guarded. He was reading a file, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Where am I? My voice was a dry rattle, barely recognizable. The Kensington Institute, he said, finally looking up. His eyes were flat, devoid of the empathy one expects in a healer. It's a private facility for the high-profile and the highly unstable. Your son and daughter-in-law were very concerned, Alistair. They said you attacked Julian. Said you've been hearing voices, recording conspiracies on your phone. You put quite a scare into them. It's a lie, I rasped. I have the recordings. I have the camera. The man stood up, walked over to the bed, and pulled a small, familiar object from his pocket. The button camera Eleanor had given me. He held it up, the lens catching the light, and then dropped it onto the floor, crushing it beneath the heel of his shoe with a sickening crunch. What camera? He asked softly. You came in here with nothing but the clothes on your back and a very high level of sedatives in your system. We've already started the paperwork for the emergency conservatorship. With your history of missed appointments and the Danbury incident, the court in Hartford will sign off on it by noon. The genius of it was breathtaking. They had used the very legal system I served to cage me. By placing me in a private psychiatric facility under a medical proxy, they had cut off my access to the world. No phone calls, no visitors, no Marcus Webb. I was a legal nonentity, a ward of the state, under the protection of the people trying to destroy me. I want to see my lawyer, I said, trying to inject the authority of the bench into my voice. You don't have a lawyer, Alistair, the man replied, heading for the door. Your son is your legal guardian now. He's already dismissed Marcus Webb. Said the man was an old family friend who was being harassed by your delusions. Sleep now. We'll start the heavy treatments in the morning. The door clicked shut, the heavy magnetic knork engaging with a sound of finality. I was alone in the humming white box. The panic came then, a tidal wave that threatened to drown what was left of my sanity. I had lost the evidence, I had lost my freedom. I had lost my home. But as I lay there, my mind racing through the thousands of cases I'd presided over, a memory surfaced. A small, insignificant detail from 40 years ago. When I'd first bought the Sterling estate, I'd been obsessed with security. I'd had a secondary set of documents, original deeds, a handwritten will, and a ledger of every private transaction I'd ever made hidden not in the safe, but in a place no one would ever look. The box under the floorboards of the potting shed. Julian didn't know about it. Sloane didn't know about it. But Eleanor Vance might. She had mentioned her grandson was a tech head. If she was still watching, if she had seen the private ambulance take me away, she was the only person on earth who knew I wasn't just a sick old man. I spent the next several hours testing the restraints. They were professional-grade reinforced leather with steel cores. I was a 72-year-old man with a concussion. I wasn't going to burst out like an action hero. I needed a different kind of leverage. At dawn, a nurse entered. She was younger, with tired eyes, and a name tag that read, Sarah. She moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had seen too much misery to let it touch her. She carried a tray with a small plastic cup and a glass of water. "Time for your meds, Alistair," she said, her voice neutral. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady, "I need you to look at me. Really look at me." She hesitated, the pill cup hovering midair. "Please, don't make this difficult." "I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to care for the sick," I said. "Look at my eyes. Are they dilated? Am I slurring? I'm a senior judge of the Superior Court. I know exactly what's happening. My son is embezzling from our family firm, and he's using this facility to hide the only witness who can testify against him." "Everyone here has a story, Judge," she said, but her hand trembled slightly. "I don't have a story. I have a bank account number," I whispered. "And I have a neighbor, Eleanor Vance, who is currently recording every vehicle that enters and leaves this facility. If you help me, I will ensure your name is on the list of people who helped save a public official. If you don't, you are an accomplice to kidnapping and elder abuse." I saw the flicker of doubt. It was the tell I had looked for in every witness for 3 decades. She wasn't part of the inner circle. She was just a shift worker in a place that accepted high-dollar donations from people like Sloane. I can't," she whispered. "The director. He's friends with your daughter-in-law. The director isn't the one who will be standing in front of a grand jury," I countered. "Sarah, check your phone. Search Sterling North embezzlement. See if there isn't a federal inquiry starting. Julian is going down, and he's taking this place with him." I was bluffing about the federal inquiry, but I knew the embezzlement was real. I'd seen the fear in Julian's eyes. She stood there for a long minute, the silence in the room stretching until it felt like it would snap. Then, she slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, disposable cell phone. She didn't hand it to me. She set it on the bedside table, just out of reach of my bound hands, and turned it so the screen was facing me. "I have to go," she said, her voice thick with fear. "I'll be back in 10 minutes to collect the tray. If the phone is still there, I'm calling security." She turned and left. I strained against the leather, the skin on my wrists tearing as I reached for the device. The pain was white-hot, but I didn't care. I managed to hook the corner of the phone with my pinky finger, dragging it toward me inch by inch. I hit the speed dial for Marcus Webb. "Marcus," I hissed when he picked up. "Don't talk, just listen. I'm at the Kensington Institute. They've drugged me and taken my evidence, but they don't have the floorboards. Tell Eleanor. Tell her the green harvest is ready. She'll know what it means. Alistair, God, we've been looking everywhere. Julian said you were..." "No time." I cut him off. "Get the box from the shed. And Marcus, call the state police. Don't call Greenwich. Blackwood has friends there. Go to the top." I heard the heavy mag lock on the door click. I dropped the phone between my legs, hiding it beneath the thin hospital gown just as Sarah re-entered. She looked at the empty table, then at me. Her face was pale, but she nodded once, a quick, sharp motion of her head. She took the tray and left without a word. I lay back, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. I had thrown the line. Now I had to see if anyone was on the other end. What happened next changed everything. 2 hours later, the door didn't open for Sarah. It didn't open for the director. It was kicked open. But it wasn't the state police. It was Vance Blackwood. He was alone, and he was carrying a leather bag that I knew didn't contain medical supplies. He looked frantic, his tie pulled loose, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look at the monitors. He walked straight to the bed and leaned over me, the scent of stale tobacco and sweat filling my senses. "You should have stayed quiet, Alistair," he growled. "Your friend Marcus is a fast mover, but he's not fast enough. He's currently being detained at a roadblock 5 miles from here. And Eleanor? Well, Eleanor had a very unfortunate fall in her garden." My heart stopped. "What did you do to her?" "I didn't do anything." Blackwood smiled, pulling a heavy glass bottle from his bag. "But you're about to have a very public, very tragic reaction to your new medication. The staff here will testify that you were combative, a sad end for a great man." He reached for the 4-line. I watched, helpless, as the clear liquid began to fill the tube. I was trapped, bound, and silenced. But as the first drop reached the port in my arm, the hum of the fluorescent light suddenly cut out. The entire building plunged into total, absolute darkness, and from the hallway, I heard a sound that made Blackwood freeze. It was the sound of a heavy, metallic object being dragged across the floor. And then, a voice that sounded like it was coming from the very earth itself. "You forgot one thing, Vance," the voice echoed. "A judge never goes to court without his bailiff." I didn't know who was in the hall, but I knew one thing. The escalation had reached its breaking point. The darkness was a physical weight, thick with the smell of floor wax and the ozone sting of the emergency generator trying and failing to kick in. In the absolute void, my senses became hyper-attuned. I heard the frantic, wet rasp of Vance Blackwood's breathing. I heard the clatter of the glass bottle hitting the floor. And then, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots. "Silas?" I croaked, my voice cracking through the gloom. "Stay still, Alistair," the voice replied. It was Silas Montgomery. For 20 years, Silas had been my primary court bailiff, a man built like a redwood with a moral compass that never wavered. He had retired 5 years ago to a quiet life in the Adirondacks, or so I'd thought. I didn't know it then, but Silas hadn't just been a friend. He'd been the silent watchdog of my career, keeping a file on every threat made against me in the halls of justice. A high-powered tactical light cut through the dark, the beam blindingly white. It found Blackwood, who was scrambling toward the door, his face a mask of sweating, feral panic. "The exit is blocked, Vance," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the small room. "And the sheriff's deputies are currently zip-tying your medical specialists in the lobby. You've had a long run of fixing things, but you can't fix a mountain." Blackwood lunged, reaching for something in his belt, but Silas moved with a speed that defied his age. There was a sickening thud, the sound of a fist meeting a solar plexus, and Blackwood collapsed like a folding chair. Silas didn't wait for him to recover. He was at my bedside in 2 strides, his massive hands working the leather restraints with a pocket knife. "You're a hard man to keep track of, Judge," Silas grunted, pulling me upright. The world spun. My head felt like it was filled with broken glass, and the chemical ice from the needle was still sluggishly moving through my system. "Marcus Webb got a message to me. Said you were in the lion's den." "Eleanor," I gasped, clutching his arm for support. He said, "Blackwood said he killed her." "Eleanor Vance is too stubborn to die," Silas said, helping me swing my legs over the side of the bed. "She's in the ICU in Greenwich, but she's talking. She's the one who gave us the location of this place. Now, can you walk? We don't have much time. This facility is a rat's nest, and the rats are starting to burn the evidence." As we moved into the hallway, the smell hit me: smoke, acrid and chemical. Down the corridor, orange light flickered. The staff, realizing the game was up, were torching the records room. It was the ultimate humiliation. They were incinerating the lives and identities of everyone held in this hellhole, just to save their own skins. We passed a glass-walled office. The door kicked off its hinges. Silas paused, his light scanning the interior. "Wait here, Alistair." He stepped inside and emerged a moment later, with a thick, leather-bound ledger. He shoved it into my hands. "Found this in the director's private safe. I think this is your who's who of Greenwich's missing elite." I leaned against the wall, my fingers trembling as I flipped the pages. My breath stopped. It wasn't just a ledger. It was a menu. Page after page of names I recognized: prominent businessmen, widows of old money families, retired politicians. All of them listed with entry dates and transfer percentages. The Kensington Institute wasn't a hospital. It was an extraction point. They took the elderly, drugged them into a state of legal incompetence, and bled their estates dry through shell companies managed by Blackwood. But as I reached the final page, I saw a document clipped to the back. My name was at the top. Alistair Sterling. Estate value, $1 million. Below it were the instructions for my treatment. I read the words, and the last shred of my heart, the part that still wanted to believe my son was just a victim of Sloane's manipulation, withered and died. Directive: Born B. Accelerated cognitive decline. Note: upon successful transfer of Sterling Holdings. Projected: Oct Moi Tarm. Patient is to be moved to terminal care status. Administration of sedative cocktail to be increased until cardiac failure. Requested by J. Sterling. The room felt like it was tilting. Requested by J. Sterling. Julian hadn't just wanted the money. He had authorized my death. He had signed the order to have his own father murdered in a padded room once the checks cleared. Alistair? We have to move, Silas urged, his hand on my shoulder. He signed it. Silas, I whispered, showing him the paper. My son signed my death warrant. The look of pity in Silas's eyes was harder to bear than the physical pain. I know, Judge. I saw the signature on the way in. We found the original in the lobby files. But right now, we need to get you to the authorities. The state police are waiting at the perimeter. No, I said, a cold, crystalline clarity settling over me. The fog was gone, replaced by the sharp, lethal focus of a man who had nothing left to lose but his pride. The state police will take me to a hospital. They'll start a thorough investigation that will take months. Julian and Sloane will hire the best defense money can buy my money. They'll burn the estate down to keep themselves out of prison. They'll claim the document was forged by Blackwood. What are you saying? I'm saying the court is still in session, Silas. And I haven't delivered the final verdict. I tucked the ledger and the terminal care directive into my gown. I looked at the man who had been my shadow for 20 years. I need you to do something for me. Something that isn't in the bailiff's handbook. Anything. Alistair, I need you to take me home. Not to the front door, to the potting shed. And then, I need you to find Marcus Webb. Tell him the closing with the Beaumonts is still on. Tell him we're going to help Julian finish the deal. Silas stared at me, his brow furrowing. You want to let them sell the house? Alistair, if they sign those final papers at the escrow office, the money disappears into offshore accounts. You'll never get it back. I don't want the money, Silas. I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. I want them to feel the weight of the gavel. I want them to have everything they ever dreamed of, right up until the moment the floor disappears. We made our way out of the burning building through a service exit. The night air was a shock to my lungs, sweet and cold. Silas's old truck was idling in the woods. He helped me into the passenger seat and threw a heavy wool blanket over my hospital gown. As we drove back toward Greenwich, I watched the lights of the city flickering in the distance. I thought about the house, the Sterling estate. It had been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather had built it with the profits from the first textile mills in New England. My father had preserved it through the Great Depression. I had raised my son there, thinking the walls were made of stone and honor. I realized then that the house was already gone. It had died the moment Julian walked Vance Blackwood through the front door. All that was left was the theater. We reached the estate at Ba, Hung A.M. The gates were closed, but Silas knew the bypass a hidden maintenance road that cut through the old Whitaker woods. He dropped me off at the edge of the property, near the potting shed. You sure about this, Alistair? Silas asked, handing me a heavy, tactical flashlight and a small, untraceable burner phone. I've spent my life following the rules, Silas, I said, and look where it got me. Locked in a box by the boy I loved. It's time to see what happens when the judge goes rogue. I watched him drive away, then turn toward the potting shed. I moved through the shadows, my legs feeling stronger with every step. The adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. I reached the shed and pried up the 3rd floorboard from the back wall. My fingers found the cold steel handle of the box. I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were the documents I'd hidden decades ago, the original land grant, the private ledger, and most importantly, the Sterling family compact, a legal clause written by my great-grandfather that stated the estate could never be sold or transferred without the physical presence and thumbprint of the reigning patriarch at the time of closing. Julian didn't know about the thumbprint clause. He'd been too lazy to read the original founding documents. He thought a signature was enough. He thought a power of attorney could bypass a century of family law. I sat in the dark of the shed, clutching the box. I pulled out the burner phone and dialed the only person who could finish this. Marcus, I said when he answered. I'm home. Listen carefully. The Beaumonts are expecting the final closing at the Harrison Escrow Group at Combe PM tomorrow. I need you to contact Harrison Beaumont personally. Tell him I'm dead. Tell him Julian is the sole executor and he's ready to sign. But tell him there's a new condition. The closing has to happen at the Sterling estate, in the grand ballroom. Alistair? Why there? It's a security nightmare for them. Because, I whispered, looking toward the main house where a single light flickered in Julian's bedroom window. A man should always be in his own home when he hears his sentence. I spent the rest of the night in the shed, watching the house. I saw Sloane pacing in the kitchen, her silhouette sharp against the light. I saw her pouring a drink, her movements jerky and frantic. They were terrified. They knew I was gone from the institute, and they were waiting for the hammer to fall. They didn't know I was already there, watching from the dark. What I didn't know yet was that Sloane had a backup plan. As I watched, she picked up her phone and made a call. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the expression on her face. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a cold, murderous resolve. She wasn't going to the escrow meeting to sign papers. She was going to the ballroom to finish what Blackwood had started. And this time, she wasn't using a needle. I gripped the steel box in my lap, the edges cutting into my skin. The stage was set. The players were in position. The final act of the Sterling legacy was about to begin, and the only question left was who would be left standing when the curtain fell. The morning of October Moy Tampth arrived with a cruel, mocking beauty. A thick silver mist clung to the rolling lawns of the Sterling estate, turning the ancient oaks into skeletal sentinels guarding a graveyard of memories. I sat in the shadows of the potting shed, my back against the rough cedar walls, clutching the steel box to my chest like a shield. My body was a map of pain, the concussion pulsed in time with my heart, and my wrists were raw from the leather straps, but my mind had never been clearer. I watched through the salt-grimed window of the shed as the house began to wake up. At by Hong AM, the kitchen lights flickered on. I saw Sloane through the glass, her movements sharp and caffeinated. She was dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, her hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent snarl of ambition. A few minutes later, Julian appeared. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He moved with a sluggish, dragging gait, his head hanging low. I watched them for an hour. I watched my son pour a cup of coffee with a hand that shook so violently the liquid splashed onto the marble counter. I watched Sloane say something to him, something sharp and stinging, and I watched Julian flinch. It was the same dynamic they'd had for years, but now the stakes were life and death. They believed I was dead, or at least dying, in a fire at the Kensington Institute. I didn't know it yet, but the fire hadn't been an accident. Blackwood had torched the place to erase the trail, but Sloane had a different reason for wanting those records turned to ash. Around Cheen, Hongam, a black town car pulled into the driveway. It wasn't the Beaumonts. A man stepped out thickset, wearing a cheap suit that struggled to contain a gym-hardened physique. He didn't look like a lawyer or an escrow officer. He looked like a cleaner. Sloane met him at the back door. They spoke for 5 minutes, and then she handed him a heavy envelope. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and drove away. My blood ran cold. Sloane was tying up loose ends. She didn't trust Julian to keep his mouth shut once the money hit the account. She was planning a second tragedy, one that would leave her as the sole, grieving widow of the Sterling heir, sitting atop a mountain of cash in the Caymans. "The court is in session, Alistair." I whispered to the empty shed, the words a cold comfort. "And the sentencing is about to begin." I opened the steel box. Inside, beneath the Sterling family compact, was a small, velvet-lined compartment. I pulled out my old signet ring, the one my father had worn, and his father before him. It was a heavy gold band with the Sterling crest, a balanced scale entwined with a serpent. It wasn't just jewelry. The underside of the crest featured a microscopic, laser-etched sequence that, when pressed into a digital scanner, verified the biological thumbprint of the wearer. I put the ring on. It felt heavy, a physical weight of 3 generations of expectations. Then, I reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out a small, glass vial of ink. Not just any ink. It was a specialized, pH-sensitive fluid I'd had formulated years ago. When applied to paper, it remained invisible for exactly 4 hours before reacting with the oxygen in the air and turning a deep, indelible blood red. I spent the next hour preparing. I moved from the shed to the main house, using the servants' passage that ran behind the kitchen, a remnant of the Mot Ngin Chin Trum Hai Muis that Julian had never bothered to explore. I moved like a phantom through the walls of my own life. I reached the master suite on the 2nd floor and found what I needed. My finest tailored suit, a deep navy wool, and a silk tie in the Sterling colors. Getting dressed was an agonizing ordeal. Every movement sent a spike of lightning through my skull. But as I tied the knot in my tie and looked in the mirror, the victim was gone. The confused old man had been buried in the ruins of the Kensington Institute. In the mirror stood the judge. At mote, Bamui PM. The gate buzzers began to chime. I retreated to the musicians' gallery, a hidden balcony that overlooked the grand ballroom. From behind the carved oak screen, I had a bird's-eye view of the stage where the final act would play out. The ballroom was a masterpiece of old-money decadence, soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Long Island Sound. In the center of the room, a long mahogany table had been set up. Julian and Sloane were already there, sitting on one side. Julian looked like a ghost in a bespoke suit. Sloane was a statue of icy resolve. Then the Beaumonts arrived. Harrison Beaumont walked in with the swagger of a conqueror. He was a man in his late 50s, his face tanned by the sun of tax havens and hardened by a lifetime of predatory business. Behind him was a small army of lawyers and his own notary. Julian? Beaumont boomed, his voice echoing off the marble. A tragic day. I heard about your father. A fire at a medical facility? Truly a loss for the legal community. Thank you, Harrison, Julian said, his voice a dry whisper. He couldn't look Beaumont in the eye. He wasn't himself at the end. Well, he's at peace now, Beaumont said, his smile never reaching his eyes. And now, we can finally bring the Sterling estate into the 21st century. My father would have loved to see this. The man who put him in a cell, now signing over his throne to his son. Sloane leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the thick stack of closing documents. Let's not get sentimental, Harrison. We have a timeline. The wire transfer is ready? Ready and waiting in a holding account in Zurich, Beaumont replied. The moment the deed is signed and the family compact is satisfied, the button is pushed. You'll be wealthy beyond your wildest dreams, Sloane. And you, Julian, you'll finally be free of the judge's shadow. I watched as the lawyers began to lay out the papers. The Sterling family compact was placed in the center. It was the most important document, the one that legally allowed the sale of the land. What they didn't know was that Marcus Webb had already intercepted the digital scanner. 2 hours ago, Marcus, dressed as a technician from the Harrison Escrow Group, had arrived at the house to calibrate the biometric equipment. He had replaced the standard scanner with a modified unit Silas had procured from an old contact in the NSA. This unit wouldn't just read a thumbprint, it would broadcast the signal to every screen in the room. We need the signature of the executor, Beaumont's lawyer said, sliding a pen toward Julian. Julian picked up the pen. He hesitated for a heartbeat, his gaze flickering toward the portrait of my father hanging on the far wall. Julian, Sloane hissed, her hand gripping his thigh under the table. Sign it. Julian signed. He signed the deed, the transfer of title, and the offshore tax indemnification. Each stroke of the pen was a nail in the coffin of our family. And now, the lawyer continued, the biometric satisfaction of the Sterling family compact. As the sole heir and executor, Julian, we need your thumbprint to verify the lineage transfer. Julian reached for the scanner. Wait, I said. The word wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel strike. It resonated in the high arched ceiling, freezing everyone in the room. Julian's head snapped up. Sloane's face went white, her mouth falling open in a silent scream. Beaumont frowned, looking around the room in confusion. I stepped out from behind the oak screen and onto the balcony, my hands resting on the railing. I looked down at them, at the son who had tried to kill me, the woman who had poisoned my life, and the enemy who had come to dance on my grave. The court is in session, I said, my voice cold and lethal. And I believe there's a conflict of interest in this room. Father? Julian gasped, the pen falling from his nerveless fingers. You're supposed to be dead? I finished for him. Burned to ash in a tragic accident at a facility where you authorized my execution. I'm afraid I'm a bit more resilient than your specialists predicted, Julian. Sloane was the first to recover. She stood up, her eyes darting toward the door. Alistair, you're confused. You've had a breakdown. Harrison, don't listen to him. He escaped from a high-security ward. He's dangerous. I'm the only one in this room who isn't dangerous, Sloane, I said. I began to descend the grand staircase, every step a deliberate, rhythmic thud. Harrison Beaumont, I hope you haven't authorized that wire transfer yet. Because the man sitting across from you doesn't own this house. And the documents he just signed, well, they're about to become very revealing. I reached the bottom of the stairs and walked toward the table. Julian shrank back in his chair, looking like a whipped dog. Harrison, I said, looking at the man who had spent 15 years hating me. You wanted to buy the Sterling legacy? You wanted to humiliate me? You've succeeded in one thing. You've exposed the rot in my own blood. But you won't get the house. The papers are signed, Sterling, Beaumont roared, slamming his fist on the table. Julian has power of attorney. He's the legal executor, because you were declared incompetent by a board of 3 doctors. Doctors who were paid by Vance Blackwood, I countered. Vance is currently in state custody, singing like a bird to a grand jury in Hartford. And as for the power of attorney, I reached the table and picked up the deed Julian had just signed. I held it up. I didn't know it yet, but the ink was already working. As they watched, the black ink of Julian's signature began to shimmer. Slowly, it turned from a standard black to a deep, pulsating red. And then, the letters began to bleed and shift. The chemical reaction I had prepared in the shed was taking hold, but it wasn't just turning red. The ink was dissolving the top layer of the parchment, revealing the words I had printed underneath in the shed using a dry press technique. Where Julian's signature had been, the paper now read, "Signature obtained under duress and fraud. Void ab initio." "What is this?" Beaumont screamed, grabbing the paper. "What kind of trick is this?" "It's not a trick, Harrison," I said. "It's a declaration of truth. But that's not the best part." I looked at Sloane. She was reaching into her charcoal jacket, her hand moving toward the pocket where I knew she kept her phone or perhaps something else. "Sloane," I said. "Don't bother calling the cleaner. Silas Montgomery is currently introducing him to the business end of a shotgun in the driveway." I turned to the digital scanner on the table. "The Sterling family compact requires the thumbprint of the reigning patriarch," I said. "Not the heir, not the executor, the patriarch." I pressed my thumb onto the scanner. Immediately, the grand ballroom state-of-the-art audio-visual system, the one Julian had installed to modernize, the house erupted into life. The massive recessed screens that usually displayed digital art flickered to life. But they didn't show art. They showed the video from the Kensington Institute. They showed Sloane counting drops into my tea. They showed Julian holding my arm while the needle went in. And they showed the terminal care directive, with Julian's signature clearly visible at the bottom. The room went silent. Even Beaumont's lawyers looked horrified. "That's the Sterling legacy, Harrison," I said, my voice cracking with a grief I couldn't hide. "That's what you were buying." Julian slumped forward, his face hitting the mahogany table. He began to sob great, racking heaves of a man who realized his soul was gone. Sloane, however, didn't sob. She looked at the screens, then at me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. "You think you've won?" she whispered. "You think I'm going to let you rot in this house while I go to prison?" She didn't pull out a phone. She pulled out a small, silver Derringer. "Sloane, no," Julian cried, looking up. She pointed the gun directly at my heart. Her finger tightened on the trigger. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was already standing right behind her. The silver barrel of the Derringer looked like a cold, unblinking eye in Sloane's hand. In that fraction of a second, the grand ballroom, a place where I had watched my late wife dance, where I had celebrated Julian's first steps, contracted into a single, lethal point of focus. Sloane's finger was white against the trigger. Her face was no longer human. It was a fractured mask of rage and thwarted ambition, the vanity of a queen realizing her throne was made of matchsticks. "You think you can judge me?" she hissed, her voice a jagged rasp that cut through the silence. "You're an artifact, Alistair. A dinosaur sitting in a museum of dead laws. I'm the one who deserves this estate. I'm the one who kept this family from drowning while your son gambled away your name." "Sloane, put the gun down," Julian begged, his voice a pathetic, broken whimper from the mahogany table. "Shut up, Julian. You're as useless as the ink on that paper." I didn't blink. I'd looked down the barrel of a gun twice before in my career, once in a courtroom in Tamwi Tam and once in a dark alley in Hartford. I knew the look of a killer, and Sloane had it. She was past logic. She was at the event horizon of her own destruction. I didn't know it yet, but the final verdict wasn't going to be delivered by the police. Just as the hammer of the Derringer began its slow, mechanical arc toward the firing pin, a massive shadow detached itself from the gloom of the heavy velvet curtains directly behind Sloane. A hand, the size of a dinner plate, reached out and clamped over the gun's cylinder, preventing it from firing. With a sharp, practiced twist, the weapon was wrenched from Sloane's grip. It was Silas. He didn't say a word. He just stepped into the light, his face as grim and immovable as a mountain. He didn't look like a bailiff anymore. He looked like an executioner. "The judge gave you a chance to surrender, Mrs. Sterling," Silas rumbled, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers. "You should have taken it. He didn't just disarm her. He spun her around and applied a restraint that made her let out a sharp, bird-like cry of pain. At that moment, the grand oak doors of the ballroom burst open for the second time. This time, it wasn't a decoy. Officer Miller led a phalanx of state police troopers into the room. The chaos that followed was clinical. Sloane was forced to the ground, her charcoal suit crumpling into the marble floor. The cleaner she had hired, the man she thought was her final ace, was being led in from the driveway in shackles, his face bloodied where Silas had neutralized him. Harrison Beaumont stood up, his face a shade of purple that looked like a looming stroke. "This is an outrage. I am a victim here. I was presented with forged documents. I'm going to sue this entire department." "Sit down, Harrison," I said, walking slowly toward the table. I picked up the glass of water Julian hadn't touched. I threw it in his face, not out of malice, but to wake him from the catatonic fog of his own cowardice. Julian sputtered, looking up at me with eyes that were red and raw. "Father. The Beaumonts," they told me. "Save it for the deposition, Julian," I said, turning back to Beaumont. "And as for you, Harrison, you didn't just come here to buy a house. You came here because you were the one who funded Vance Blackwood's fixer firm 10 years ago. I've spent the last 6 hours in the potting shed looking through the private ledger my father kept. He knew your father was dirty, Harrison. And he knew you were the one who laundered the money from the racketeering case I presided over." Beaumont's jaw tightened. The bluster vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. "You have no proof of that, Sterling. That ledger is hearsay." "It's not just a ledger, Harrison," I said, pulling a second, smaller document from my pocket. It was a micro SD card, encased in a plastic sleeve. While I was at the Kensington Institute, I wasn't just lying in bed. I was talking to a nurse named Sarah. She was the one who helped me realize that Blackwood wasn't just working for Sloane. He was sending encrypted reports to a server owned by the Beaumont Group. "You weren't just buying my house, you were buying the evidence of your own father's crimes that you believed were hidden in my safe." I looked at Officer Miller. "Officer, take them all. The son, the wife, the rival. They're all part of the same conspiracy." The room cleared out. I watched as Sloane was led away, her head held high even in handcuffs, the ultimate narcissist to the very end. I watched Julian, who was weeping so loudly it echoed down the hallway, a sound that would haunt my dreams until the day I joined Margaret in the earth. And then, I was alone. The ballroom was silent, save for the hum of the video screen still playing the looped footage of my own betrayal. I sat in the chair Julian had occupied, the weight of the night finally catching up to me. The concussion was a thundering roar now. I reached for the mahogany table to steady myself, and my hand brushed against the leather bag Blackwood had left behind. In the confusion, the police had missed it. It was tucked under the table, forgotten. I pulled it up. It was a heavy, old-fashioned doctor's bag. I opened it, expecting to find more needles, more chemicals, more tools of my own erasure. I didn't know it yet, but what was inside that bag was the one thing that could truly break me. Inside, wrapped in a silk scarf that I recognized instantly it was Margaret's favorite, the one she'd been wearing the night she died, was a stack of letters. They were dated 4 years ago, just before Margaret's accidental fall down the grand staircase. I pulled the first one out. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly tore the parchment. "Dear Vance," the letter began, in a handwriting that was undeniably Sloane's. "The judge is too sharp. But Margaret. She's noticed the discrepancies in the household accounts. She's going to tell him. We can't wait for the long game. She has to go now. Make it look like a fall. Julian is already on board. He thinks it's just a medical intervention." The room tilted. The air turned to liquid. I couldn't breathe. I had spent 4 years grieving my wife, thinking she had simply tripped in the dark. I had spent 4 years blaming myself for not being there to catch her. And all the while, the woman I had welcomed into my home and the son I had nurtured had been the ones who pushed her. Julian didn't just authorize my death. He had helped facilitate the murder of his own mother. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat, a howl of pure, unadulterated agony that no courtroom, no law, and no sense of justice could ever satisfy. I stood up, the bag clutched to my chest, and stumbled toward the portrait of Margaret. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my tears blurring her beautiful painted face. I was a judge of the world, but I was a fool in my own house. I felt a presence beside me. It was Silas. He had come back in, his heavy boots silent on the marble. He looked at the letters in my hand, then at the portrait. He didn't say a word. He just put his hand on my shoulder, a steady, grounding force in the middle of a hurricane. "What do we do now, Alistair?" he asked quietly. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The grief didn't go away, but it transformed. It hardened into something cold, something ancient. It was the same feeling I had when I looked at a defendant who was beyond redemption. "Justice hasn't been served yet, Silas," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "The police have them for fraud. They have them for kidnapping, but they don't have them for Margaret. How are you going to prove it?" "I'm not going to prove it in a courtroom," I said, looking at the biometric scanner on the table. "I'm going to use the Sterling family compact one last time." I realized then that the Beaumont's wire transfer hadn't been blocked. It was sitting in a holding account, waiting for the final thumbprint verification. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge I had planned was nothing compared to the one I was about to execute. I sat back down at the table. I pulled the scanner toward me. "Silas," I said, "call Marcus Webb. Tell him I need him to execute the Solomon Protocol. He'll know what it means. It's the contingency plan my father made in case the family ever turned on itself. Alistair, if you do that, the estate, the name, it all disappears." "The name is already dead, Silas," I said. "It's time to burn the graveyard." I pressed my thumb onto the scanner for the final time, but this time I didn't just verify the deed. I entered a secondary code, a sequence of numbers that only the reigning patriarch was given upon the death of his predecessor. The screens in the room changed again. They didn't show the Kensington Institute. They showed the internal servers of the Beaumont Group, the offshore accounts of Julian Sterling, and the private trust of Sloane Sterling. The Solomon Protocol wasn't a defense. It was a digital, scorched earth virus. It was designed to trigger a simultaneous liquidation of all linked assets and donate them every single cent to a list of charities for the victims of elder abuse and corporate fraud. In 10 seconds, Sloane wouldn't just be a prisoner. She would be a pauper. In 10 seconds, Julian wouldn't have enough money to buy a pack of cigarettes in the commissary. And the Beaumonts? Their entire empire was built on the foundation of the Sterling investments. Without them, the Beaumont Group would collapse like a house of cards. "Watch the clock, Silas," I said, my finger hovering over the final enter key. But as I was about to strike the key, the burner phone in my pocket began to vibrate. It was a video call from the local precinct. I answered it. The screen showed an interrogation room. Julian was sitting there, his face buried in his hands. But Sloane was looking directly into the camera. She had somehow managed to get a phone. "You think you've won, Alistair?" she whispered, her voice echoing through the ballroom. "Check the wine cellar." The cleaner didn't just have an envelope. He had a timer. If I don't check in every 30 minutes with a code, the Sterling estate goes up in a cloud of localized thermite. You have 5 minutes left. I looked at Silas. I looked at the grand, ancient house around me. I didn't know it yet, but the choice I was about to make would define the rest of my life. I looked back at the screen. I looked at the woman who had killed my wife and tried to kill me. "Then I'll see you in hell, Sloane," I said. I didn't run for the exit. I didn't call the bomb squad. I turned to the mahogany table and struck the enter key, finalizing the Solomon Protocol. The screens turned bright green. Assets liquidated. Transfers complete. And then I sat back in my chair, picked up the letters from Margaret, and waited for the heat. But as the countdown on Sloane's screen hit 0, nothing happened. The house didn't explode. The walls didn't crumble. Instead, a new face appeared on the screens in the ballroom. It was Eleanor Vance. She was sitting in a hospital bed, her head bandaged, but she was smiling. "I told you my grandson was a tech head, Alistair," she chirped. "He found the thermite triggers an hour ago while you were in the shed. He replaced them with glitter bombs. Happy retirement, you old grump." I let out a laugh, a real, booming laugh that shook the very foundations of my soul. I looked at Silas, who was actually grinning. The villains were broke. The house was saved. The truth was out. But as I looked at the letters in my hand, I knew the resolution wasn't over. I had one more thing to do before I could truly be at peace. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was waiting for me at the local cemetery. The grand ballroom of the Sterling estate, once a stage for a high-stakes psychological war, now felt like a hollowed-out cathedral. The hum of the digital screens had faded into a low, ghostly static before finally cutting to black. The air was thick, not with the smell of thermite, but with the cloying, festive scent of the glitter that had blanketed the floor in a shimmering, ridiculous carpet of pink and silver. Silas stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged mountain against the blue dawn. He didn't say a word, but his presence was the only thing keeping the walls from closing in on me. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands resting on the leather doctor's bag. The Solomon Protocol had finished its work. On the screens of my mind, I could still see the green text. Assets liquidated. I was a man who had spent 40 years quantifying the value of things: lives, crimes, property. Now, I was a billionaire on paper and a pauper in spirit. The money was gone, flowing like a cleansing river into the accounts of charities that served the very people I had almost become. The forgotten, the elderly, the voiceless victims of the powerful. I didn't know it yet, but the true cost of the sterling legacy hadn't been tallied in dollars. 3 days later, the Greenwich police station was a hive of activity. Detective Miller had been promoted, the fix at the local precinct having been purged along with Blackwood's contacts. I sat in a sterile observation room, looking through the one-way glass at Sloane. She sat in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, her hair limp, her skin sallow without the expensive creams and the light of vanity. She looked at her hands that were now empty of rings and power. She refused to speak to anyone but her lawyer, a public defender she treated with the disdain one might show a stray dog. She was a woman who had tried to buy the world and ended up with a 6x9 cell. But it was the interrogation room next door that drew my attention. Julian sat there, huddled over a cold cup of coffee. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't asked for a phone call. He just sat there, weeping silently, a man who had finally realized that the shadow he had spent his life trying to escape was the only thing that had ever protected him. "He wants to see you, Alistair," Miller said, stepping into the observation room. "He says he has something to tell you, something that wasn't in the recordings." "I have nothing to say to him," I replied, my voice a dry, dead thing. "He says it's about your wife, about Margaret." The air left the room. I felt a surge of the old, judicial fury, but it was tempered by a crushing, leaden curiosity. I walked into the interrogation room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me. Julian didn't look up. He didn't even flinch at the sound of the chair scraping against the floor as I sat across from him. "Father," he whispered. "Don't call me that," I said. "You're a defendant in a murder conspiracy, Julian. Address me as Judge Sterling, or don't address me at all." He flinched then, a sharp, physical reaction to the coldness in my voice. He looked up, and for the first time, I didn't see a Sterling. I saw a broken, middle-aged man who had never grown up. "You found the bag," Julian said. "The letters. I found the proof that you helped Sloane push your mother down those stairs," I said, leaning forward. "I found the proof that you stood by while she was murdered for a few ledger entries." "No," Julian said, his voice suddenly gaining a strange, desperate strength. "That's what Sloane wanted you to believe. That's what she wanted me to believe. She told me she found Mother at the bottom of the stairs. She told me Mother had found out about my gambling debts and was going to disinherit me. She said Mother had a stroke and fell. I believed her because I was a coward, Alistair. I believed her because I didn't want to be the reason she was dead. I watched him, my internal lie detector screaming for a crack in the narrative. The letters, Julian. Sloane's letters to Blackwood. They say you were on board." Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He slid it across the table. It wasn't a legal document. It was a receipt for a private security deposit box in a bank in Stamford, dated 2 days after Margaret's death. "Go to the bank, Father," Julian said, his voice breaking. "Use your thumbprint." Mother set it up. She knew. She knew Sloane was poisoned from the very beginning. She didn't fall because of a stroke, and she didn't fall because I pushed her. I left the station without another word. I drove to Stamford, my mind a whirlwind of static. I reached the bank, went through the security protocols, and stood in the quiet, chilled air of the vault. I pressed my thumb to the scanner. The box slid out with a mechanical hum. Inside was a single, silver-framed photograph of the three of us, Alistair, Margaret, and a young Julian on a sailboat in Maine, and behind it, a digital voice recorder. I pressed play. Margaret's voice, warm and elegant as a cello, filled the small vault. "Alistair, if you're hearing this, then the worst has happened. Not to me, but to Julian. I've watched him, my love. I've watched Sloane wrap her coils around him. She thinks I'm oblivious, but a sterling woman is never blind. I've found the accounts. I know she's been stealing, but more importantly, I've found the vials in the guest room. She's been microdosing you, Alistair. Your forgetfulness isn't age. It's her." The recording paused, a soft sigh echoing in the metal box. I'm going to confront her tonight. I've hidden the real ledgers in the potting shed, under the floorboards. I know Julian is too weak to stop her, but I hope he's strong enough to eventually find this. If I don't make it to morning, Alistair, don't blame the boy. He's a fool, but he's our fool. Save him if you can. But destroy her. The recording ended. I sat in the vault for a long time, the silence pressing against my eardrums. Margaret hadn't been a victim of a tragic accident. She had been a soldier in a war I didn't even know was being fought. She had gone to her death trying to protect me, while I was busy worrying about the integrity of the law. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was a gift she'd left for my soul. I realized then why Julian had put me in the Kensington Institute. It wasn't to kill me. It was the only way his cowardly mind could think of to keep me away from Sloane's cleaner. He knew Sloane was planning a final solution for my health, and he thought by locking me in a padded room, he was keeping me safe. It was a warped, pathetic mercy, but it was the only mercy he had left. I left the bank and drove back to the estate. I didn't go into the house. I walked through the misty garden to the Sterling family plot at the edge of the woods. I stood before Margaret's headstone, the marble cool and damp under my touch. "You won, Margaret," I whispered. "She's gone. The money is gone. The house is quiet." But as I turned to leave, I saw a single, fresh white rose resting on the base of the stone. I looked around. The garden was empty. Silas was at his cabin. Eleanor was still in the hospital. Marcus was in Hartford. I picked up the rose. Tucked into the petals was a small, handwritten note. "I'm sorry I wasn't faster, Judge, but a bailiff never leaves his post. Check the second drawer of the potting shed box, the one with the false bottom. Margaret wanted you to have a retirement that didn't involve a courtroom." I walked back to the shed. I pulled out the steel box and found the false bottom. Inside was a simple, non-transferable deed to a small cottage in the Adirondacks, right next to Silas Montgomery's property, and a small, handwritten check for $100,000, the only money the Solomon Protocol hadn't touched because it had been placed in a bailiff's emergency fund 30 years ago by my father. It wasn't a fortune, it was a life. A week later, the Sterling estate was officially handed over to the Margaret Sterling Foundation for Elder Protection. The house would be turned into a sanctuary for those who had been discarded by their families, a place where no one would ever be drugged into silence. I stood at the gates with my one suitcase, the same one I'd taken to the motel on the night this all began. Silas was waiting in his truck, the engine idling with a steady, reassuring thrum. "Ready, Alistair?" he asked. "Ready, Silas." As we pulled away, I looked back at the grand, stone mansion. I saw the windows of my study, where I had spent my life judging others. I saw the grand ballroom, where the glitter was still being swept away. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel regret. I felt the lightness of a man who had finally delivered a verdict on his own life. Julian would spend 10 years in a minimum security facility, the Mercy I had granted him by testifying to his intent to protect me, however twisted it was. Sloane would never see the sun without bars in front of it. The Beaumonts were in the middle of a federal bankruptcy that would take decades to untangle. Justice, I realized, isn't always about the winning or the losing. It's about the balance. It's about making sure that at the end of the day, the scales are level, even if you have to break the world to do it. I didn't know it when I started this journey, but the man I was, the rigid, detached judge, had to die so that the human being could finally live. I rolled down the window and let the cold October air hit my face. The road ahead was long, winding through the mountains toward a quiet cabin and a neighbor who knew how to play a decent game of chess. I reached into my pocket and touched the signet ring one last time, then I pulled it off and tossed it into the tall grass by the side of the road. I wasn't a Sterling anymore. I wasn't a judge. I was just Alistair. And for the first time in 72 years, that was enough. The silence wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was just peace.